Chancellor, can we start where we left off last year? Let's remind ourselves of what you said to me 12 months ago.
We've now wiped the slate clean under the mismanagement and the chaos of the previous government. It's now on us. We've put everything out into the open.
Okay.
We've set the spending envelope for the course of this Parliament. We don't need to come back for more. We've done that now. We've wiped the slate clean. Yeah, look, I'm not going to be able to write 5 years' worth of budgets on this show today, but what we have
I'm just
done...
saying, will there be more tax rises?
You're right, Trevor. There is no need to come back with another budget like this. We never need to do that again. We've now, Trevor, set the spending envelope for the remainder of this Parliament. We don't need to increase taxes further. We need to do two things now. We need to reform our public services to make sure they work better, and we need to grow our economy.
That wasn't true, was it?
Well, the budget this year was not on the scale of the one last year, but as I set out in my speech at the beginning of November, the context for this budget did change, and I did have to ask people to contribute more. And the biggest thing that happened between the spring forecast and the forecast that the Office of Budget Responsibility provided for this budget was a big downgrade in productivity. Now, the OBR have been really clear. That reflects the legacy of the previous 14 years, not anything that this government has done in the last 16 months, but nevertheless, that productivity downgrade means that they forecast tax receipts are going to be £16 billion lower, which is why I gave a speech at the beginning of November saying that the OBR downgrade has had big impact on the public finances, and it was why I would need to ask people to contribute more.
Well, let's unpack that. We'll come to the speech at the beginning of November and the OBR in a second.
Yeah.
But let's just deal with the simple fact that what you said last year turned out not to be true. The scale of the tax rises this year is not far off. Last year it was 40 billion, this year it's 26 billion. Literally, it just wasn't true. And, you know, it's not a fault, but I think we should just make sure that we start on the same footing, that what you thought you were going to be able to do turned out not to be the case.
I think that is true, but for reasons on this... not in my control. The Office of Budget Responsibility rightly provides independent forecasts. Now, you know, it's up to them to justify the timing of the productivity review. They are very clear the productivity reflects the last 2 years.
Because I want to come to that. But you just said it because of things that were not in your control. But literally in that clip, you said, this is now on us.
Yes.
You said 12 months ago, everything that happens from now is my choice. It is on us.
Well, look, the Office of Budget Responsibility, you're not interviewing them, you're interviewing me, but they decided
to do a review.
Well, they decided to do a review of productivity. That is the Conservative legacy. The Office of Budget Responsibility are really clear that productivity downgrade does not reflect anything that this government has done. I set the budget within the context of the independent... Now, I could have just said, well, I'll ignore the Office of Budget Responsibility. That's what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did, and look at the impact of that. That crashed the economy. It sent interest rates soaring, put pensions in peril. I've always said I would never take risks with the public finances.
You said in a piece last Sunday, that we wouldn't be looking in the rear-view mirror. You've already mentioned Tories twice in this interview. You've mentioned them 26 times in your budget. So let's just leave the Tories to one side for a moment. Can we come to your point about the OBR? You said... you want to be honest. When you spoke to the country on November the 4th, you warned that we'd all have to contribute to filling this financial black hole. But you already knew at that moment that the OBR had assessed that your plans at that point, let's be clear, the plans that you'd given them at that point would deliver a surplus of £4 billion. Why did you lie to the country?
Well, first of all, that was pre any measures, as they've been very clear. But if I was on this programme today and I said, I've got a £4.2 billion surplus, you would have said, and rightly so, that is not enough, Chancellor. That would have been the lowest surplus.
Well, never mind what I would have said. Why didn't you say to the country, you know what, I've got £4 billion, I don't think it's enough, I want to do some other things. Why didn't you make it clear that the OBR had already told you you had the a little bit more than £4 billion surplus on the plans that you had given them?
Right, the way that the OBR forecast works is that they do the forecast before any plan. So this was pre any measures. But the just over £4 billion surplus was not enough. I said in that speech that I wanted to achieve three things in the budget. Tackling the cost of living, which is why I took £150 off of energy bills and froze prescription charges and rail fares. I wanted to continue to cut NHS waiting lists, which is why I protected NHS spending. And that I wanted to bring the debt and the borrowing down, which is one of the reasons why I increased the headroom. £4 billion of headroom would not have been enough, and it would not give the Bank of England space to continue to cut interest rates. Just this week, Lloyds Banking Group, the biggest mortgage lender, have cut interest rates on their mortgages, giving much relief to homeowners and people getting new mortgages.
Yes.
I was clear that we needed to rebuild those public finances.
The reason you didn't tell us that you had, at that point, been advised you had the £4 billion before any measures was that you knew you wanted to do the things that you did do on welfare and reversing on the winter fuel allowance, which you knew about, and so on. So essentially, the point here is that you knew that you were going to want tax rises for decisions that you wanted to make on welfare. It wasn't something that was done to you. These were your choices, and that's why this issue is important. That at that point, you didn't say to the country, we're more or less in balance, but I am going to ask you for more taxes because I want to make a choice to spend more money on welfare, for example. Why didn't you say that at that time? What you said to us is, big black hole, it's terrible.
£4 billion is clearly not enough fiscal headroom. It would have been the lowest headroom.
Indeed, and you made a choice. You made a choice to double the fiscal headroom.
Yes,
but my point is, you made that choice.
Yes, I did.
And you didn't tell us at the point when you said, you warned us we were going to have to pay, that we were going to have to pay for choices that you were making now.
Yes, and I said in that speech that I wanted to reduce the debt and reduce borrowing. So I increased that fiscal headroom. I'm very happy.
You didn't tell us you were going to tax us more in order to give you an extra £10 billion fiscal headroom.
No, Trevor, that's just not true. In that speech...
No, you didn't say it. Where did you say that in that speech?
I said in that speech that I wanted to increase our resilience by increasing the headroom. I was very clear in that speech.
And welfare spending.
Well, one of the things I did in the budget was lift 450,000 children out of poverty. That was funded through cracking down on tax avoidance, more measures in the budget, and introducing a gambling tax. I always said that to reduce child poverty, it had to be fully costed and fully funded. So the gambling tax and cracking down on tax avoidance and evasion was used to reduce child poverty. That was the right thing to do. I'm very happy to defend my choices on the cost of living, reducing child poverty, reducing NHS waiting lists and building that financial resilience into our numbers.
Let me put this question to you in maybe a less aggressive way. Why can't you say, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I decided at that point I was going to ask for more taxes in order to do Labour things, which involves particularly raising the amount we spend on welfare. Why can't you just say that's what you decided to do?
Well, the three objectives I had in the budget were to cut the cost of living, which is why we gave £150 off of everyone's NHS bills and froze prescription charges and rail fares. I said in that speech at the beginning of November that I wanted to cut NHS waiting lists. Both of those are very Labour things to do, but also I wanted to ensure that our economy was resilient to withstand shocks like conflicts, like trade barriers, and that's why I wanted to increase the headroom. To do those things in the context of a downgrade in our productivity, which costs £16 billion, I needed to increase taxes. And I was honest and frank about that in the speech that I gave at the beginning of November. I kept that contribution that everyone needs to make as low as possible through a number of progressive reforms.
You do keep mentioning...
Those are Labour choices.
You do keep mentioning the downgrade, but actually you knew at the time from the OBR that that downgrade had been balanced by wage increases, tax revenues from wage increases
let me address that
and inflation.
Head on. Let me address that head on, Trevor. The biggest single factor for the lower tax revenues is the productivity downgrade. But in addition to that, The OBR said before the measures that I took in the budget that inflation was going to be higher and that would result in higher tax receipts. But that's not a good thing because higher inflation, inflating tax revenues...
Nobody thinks it's a great thing.
No,
All I'm saying is...
What I'm saying is that...
You keep saying it...
Trevor, I wanted to address this, and it is really important that people understand this. Because of the measures that I took in the budget, inflation is going to be 0.4 percentage points lower next year than they originally forecast because of our cost of living measures to reduce inflation. And so I needed to address as well the higher inflation that the OBR said would otherwise result. So there were a number of things happening in the economy, lower productivity growth, but also higher inflation, and I needed to address both of those.
I wish you could talk in more detail about that, but no doubt we'll come back and talk about whether that's worked in inflation in a year's time. Now, but the leader of the opposition...
Let's see, but the OBR say 0.4 percentage points off of inflation, in part because of £150 off of energy bills.
Hasn't... OK. Look, the leader of the opposition said about the choices that you made that, I'm quoting here, for months, Reeves has lied to the public to justify record tax hikes to pay for more welfare. Did you lie?
Look, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I want to reduce child poverty. I make no apologies for that. This will be the biggest ever reduction in child poverty in a parliament ever. And I'm proud to be the Chancellor that lifts 500,000 kids out of poverty. That means kids not going to bed hungry. It means kids not waking up in cold and damp homes. And I am proud and I'm very happy to defend the choices I've made.
I just asked you, did you lie? And I have to say, the answer I was looking for was no. I didn't hear the word no.
But you also asked about welfare in that question.
No, I just asked you, did you lie?
Of course I didn't.
Good, OK. By the way, was the Prime Minister informed through all of this process?
Yes,
and he was right there with you on it all.
Yes, of course.
Decisions you made, what you said on November the 4th.
Yes, we are a partnership. We have a budget board. The Prime Minister, Keir, and myself met regularly to discuss the budget and the choices, because these are the choices of this government. And I'm really proud of the choices that we made to cut waiting lists, to cut inflation, and to build up that resilience in our economy.
OK, let's get off process and talk about the actual central choice that you made, which is the decision to lift the two-child benefit cap. Extra £3,500 every household on universal credit with a third child. Why should a working woman who has restricted the size of her own family to 2 children or fewer subsidise a woman who has made a different choice?
Well, first of all, it is men and women who decide to have children, and the choice
benefits go to the mother. For children, anyway.
They go to the main carer. Yeah. That is predominantly women.
But you know the question I'm asking you. Why should that woman subsidise a woman who's made another choice?
I really would prefer you to talk about families. But OK, so what the two-child limit did was push children into poverty. More than 300,000 children were pushed into poverty because of this choice, and 450,000 children will be taken out of poverty. And I think, and I'm a mum with 2 children, I am very happy to support children from poorer backgrounds live more fulfilling lives. In fact, when I became Chancellor, I said that I knew that my time as Chancellor would have been a success if there are ordinary children from working-class backgrounds living more fulfilling lives. And I think it is very difficult to live a fulfilling life when you're growing up in poverty. We've got children stuck in bed and breakfast accommodation because their parents can't afford the rent. We've got kids going to school hungry because parents are making choices between heating the home and putting food on the table. We've got children going to school with coats that don't fit, that shoes don't fit, with shoes with holes in it. And I've seen it myself in my own constituency and around the country. And I am not willing to just stand by knowing that there's something that I can do about it as Chancellor. And that's why we made that choice to lift 500,000 kids out of poverty. And if I do nothing else during the course of this Parliament that ensure that kids don't grow up hungry, then I'm really pleased.
By the way, last time I asked you that question, you didn't say any of that. You said we couldn't afford it.
And what I set out in the budget is how it is fully costed and fully funded. So we introduced an increase in online gambling taxes. So online gaming, the taxes goes up to 40%.
Yes.
Online betting, the taxes go up to 25%. That brings in more than £1 billion a year. Well, Trevor...
I get the political argument.
No,
we don't ring-fence gambling taxes to pay for this.
No,
I mean, honestly.
Well, actually, what you need to do if you introduce a policy is explain where the money's going to come from. And I have done that. We're cracking down on tax avoidance. In fact, we're going to raise £10 billion extra a year through cracking down on tax avoidance. And we are introducing these taxes on online gambling.
It came from freezing tax thresholds.
Well,
but look, you still haven't answered... You haven't answered the moral question I've asked you, which is the question that your constituents will ask. Because you talk about as though actually children just arrive by accident. People make a choice. Are the 560,000 households who are going to benefit from this change, are they all people who had no choice about whether they had the third or fourth child?
Well, in my constituency of Leeds West and Pudsey, around a third of kids grow up in poverty. And you asked about my constituency.
Was the people make a choice. And my question, which you still haven't answered, is what do you say to the person who says, I made this choice, why should I subsidise somebody who made a different choice?
Because all children should live fulfilling lives, and it is the children in the end that pay the price of poverty. But let me say something else about choice. Because under the two-child cap that the Conservatives introduced, there was something called the rape clause. So if you... A rape clause, which meant that if you conceived non-consensually, you could still get support if you could prove that your child was born non-consensually. Well, as the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'm not willing to preside over a system where a woman has to prove that. And so along with getting rid of that two-child cap, we've also got rid of that rape clause. And I think every single woman in this country, to come back to your first question, will be very pleased to hear that.
I would freely acknowledge, I have a view about it, that what you've just said was a scandal. But it had very little to do with the actual choice you've made. Let me put it this to you.
You can't have a limit that doesn't involve something like that, because unless you said that a child that was born non-consensually didn't deserve support. So any system
there are not
that
560,000 children who are the result of that situation.
No, there's not. But that clause will exist as long as you cap the number of children that get support. But in the end, it is children that pay the price of this vicious and cruel policy, and that will end in April next year.
Let me just put it to you that there may be another reason here. This policy has been discussed many times. Here's what the public thinks. 37% of Labour voters in 2020, those who voted Labour in 2024, are in favour of scrapping the cap. More than half of Labour voters are not in favour of it. Who is in favour of it are Labour Party members, 84% of them. Are you choosing party over country here?
I'm choosing children, Trevor. This lifts more than 500,000 children out of poverty. Combined with our changes on free breakfast clubs, extending free school meals, 30 hours free childcare for working parents with preschool-age children. You can put up those percentages, but the people I was thinking about were kids who I know in my constituency who go to school hungry and go to bed in cold and damp homes. And from April next year, those parents will have a bit more support to help their kids.
One other issue that came out of the budget, of course, the big thing was the stealth taxes. Now, I chair a medium-sized business myself. We've done pretty well. We want to expand. I know what's going to happen this week. Chief Financial Officer is going to say, rise in national insurance, massive hike in business rates. They've already added tens of thousands to our overheads. The CHRO is going to warn that the stealth taxes, the freezing of the thresholds, have just pushed up the cost of hiring because candidates know that they're going to get less out of their pay packets because more is going to HMRC. Your big priority is supposed to be growth. You're actually killing growth.
The freezing the thresholds that I announced come in 2028, so there would be no change before that point. Of course, the previous government froze thresholds for 7 years.
We didn't know
but
that you were going to extend
that.
them for another 3 years.
Well, I did say in that speech at the beginning of November that we would have to ask people to contribute more. Now, we didn't put up the tax rate and we didn't do anything in April next year. But yes, from 2028, we have thrown...
But bosses are already saying that they're going to slow hiring.
Well, if you look at some of the announcements...
Because of this.
Well, Trevor, if you look at some of the announcements that's come since I made the budget, the Co-op, the supermarket group, have said they're going to put £1 billion into cutting or freezing prices of 2,700 items in their shops. JP Morgan have announced the investment of a new office in London employing 12,000 people. Goldman Sachs are doubling the number of people that they are going to employ in Birmingham. So look at the announcements that we've had since that budget: more hiring, more jobs, lower prices.
One last question, if I may. I know you've given us generously more time than we should have. How did you feel about the Leader of the Opposition's response to you, including her mocking and mimicking you, and then she put it, talking to you woman to woman?
There was a leak of the budget document 45 minutes before I stood up to deliver my speech. One of my worries is that the opposition had all that time to go through all of the documents, something which you do not usually have the luxury of, and I've had to respond to a budget before as Shadow Chancellor. And so I was concerned that there would be a forensic analysis on the floor, which you wouldn't usually have. But there wasn't any of that. There wasn't an economic argument in Kemi Badenoch's response to my budget. And so if she wants to resort to personal attacks, that's fine, that's her choice. But I want to focus on the issues, cutting the cost of living, cutting NHS waiting lists and cutting the debt and borrowing. OK,
last question. You talked about the OBR. Is it time for the chair of the OBR to go?
Look, there is no one who's a bigger supporter of the Office of Budget Responsibility than me. I reappointed Richard Hughes in the summer. We've strengthened the powers of the OBR. We will get a report tomorrow, the report that looks at what happens about that budget leak. It was clearly serious. It was clearly a serious breach of protocol.
But he's safe.
But I'll see that report
But
tomorrow.
his position's safe.
Well, I'll see that report tomorrow. But I've got a huge amount of respect both for Richard and for the Office of Budget Responsibility. But look, I'll get that report tomorrow now.
Chancellor, thank you so much you gave us extra time, and I appreciate it.
A pleasure.